Worrying, overthinking, and anxiety are words that go hand in hand, and we often use them interchangeably. But when you start seeing worry as a false friend that it is, I tend to find that the clients I work with get some relief from all three. If you stick around for this video, I will teach you the same frameworks I've used personally that have helped, and also that I use in my private practice that help you stop worrying and overthinking and combat anxiety. In this video, we're going to cover the paradox of worry, how the very act of overthinking creates this false sense of security, which explains why willpower alone is never enough to break the cycle. I'm going to teach you the 5 rules of anxiety, which create the invisible mental prison that we often miss, which will help you see that just having coping skills and coping strategies isn't always enough. I'm going to tell you all about the anxiety loop, the self-reinforcing cycle that keeps you searching endlessly for perfect answers so you can spot when your anxiety is tricking you into more worrying and overthinking. And then finally, I'm going to give you my 3-layered anti-anxiety strategy, a practical framework to combating anxiety. It's going to be a great help if you want to stop worrying and overthinking. Let's start with the paradox of worry, though. The people that struggle most with anxiety, myself included, have been sold a dangerous myth. And that is, if we think about a problem enough, we're going to feel better. In a really basic way, anxiety plus thinking equals worry. So in theory, if we could just stop thinking as much, we'd lower how much we worry. Or if we're less anxious, we'd worry less too. And of course, both are true, but there is a paradox that I think some therapists miss. And that is that worry actually provides us some relief. I know, even though it doesn't feel good to worry and nobody likes being worried or overthinking or being anxious, the habit of worrying is a way to avoid some other feelings. And that is an emotional payoff. Whenever there is a payoff to any mental process, it's very easy for that to become a habit. And habits are super annoying, very efficient, and almost always unconscious. So let's break this down a little bit. When someone worries, they're engaging in a primarily mental or thought-based activity, right? If you want to get super technical here, thinking is all going on in the prefrontal cortex. That's where language, reasoning, and logic exists. And when we worry, we're using all of those parts because we're actually talking to ourselves. We're generating scenarios, playing out possibilities. It's all very thought-based. When all of this is going on in that part of our brain, the feelings part of the brain, the amygdala, is less activated. So we're spared some of those deeper-rooted feelings that are going on. Worry is a cognitive process, not an emotional one. That's a lot of words, I know. Let's get experiential. Let's try and vividly imagine a really frightening scenario, like standing on the edge of a very tall building looking down. Feel the wind in your hair, the sense of space opening up before you, maybe that little bit of vertigo that you get. If you really focus on that, you're likely going to have some physical reactions, increased heart rate, sweaty palms, that sort of dropping sensation in your stomach. Let's contrast this to intellectually worrying about hypothetically standing on the edge of a building. So if, hypothetically, you happen to find yourself on a tall building, that would be bad. You could theoretically get hurt. You could worry about who's around to help you. When you're thinking about being on top of a very tall building, you're using your rational part of your brain, and I'm pretty sure you'll find that the physical response is not nearly as intense. And research confirms this. When we get people in a lab to think about fear-based stimulus, their cardiovascular arousal is nowhere near as significant as when they're actually imagining it. And this is really crucial for understanding why we worry and why people with anxiety are a little bit addicted to it. That's not to say that worry doesn't produce any distress. It obviously does, but it simultaneously puts the lockdown on how much distress or other feelings you have. So it's not hard to imagine after that exercise that if you had a terrible fear of heights, it's going to be better to worry about being on a tall building than it is to actually imagine being on a tall building. So worry is a really good way for us to avoid feelings. It puts us in a thinking mode rather than a feelings mode. Now, to make this even more confusing, the act of worrying actually reinforces worrying behavior because there's a payoff. So if I'm afraid of monsters, I'm going to worry more about if and when I come across a monster because it's way better than actually imagining being face to face with a monster. Therefore, worrying is a brilliant idea, according to my brain. This can lead to a little bit of magical thinking, an unconscious belief that my worry or any specific thought process can directly cause or prevent events. So if I stop worrying, then I'm going to run into a monster. Or as long as I keep worrying about if I'm going to run into a monster, then it might not happen. So in other words, magical thinking gives us this kind of superpower. It's an illusion of control. Magical thinking is just another layer that reinforces in our brain that it's a really good idea to continue worrying. Now, the consequences of worrying, or this mental trap that worrying creates, is really important for us therapists, because we love it when our clients talk about their feelings, express their feelings, and actually feel their feelings. But worry stops those feelings from coming up, and we can't actually have that feeling. Then we don't experience it, then we don't process it. So those feelings don't go anywhere. Secondly, we don't tame them, we don't soothe them. And thirdly, we don't ever get to understand what those feelings need. So sometimes feelings have needs attached to them. If you feel lonely, you might need to call someone. If you are terrified of that monster in your basement, you might need to move house, right? Feelings have needs attached to them. If you don't feel the feeling, then you don't know what needs they have. Clients will often come to therapy and want help with worrying. And some clients might even get mad at their therapist because they can't stop worrying and none of the tools that they get given work or stop them from worrying. But until we get them to see that there is a benefit or a payoff to worrying, then there's not really much of an incentive for them to stop worrying. That's why exposure therapy doesn't always work. So if you take a client into the basement to confront that monster and they are worrying before and during that adventure into the basement, and even after their exposure to the monster in the basement, the thinking process is preventing all of those emotions from coming up. They're not actually experiencing the feelings, so they're not learning to soothe or tolerate those feelings because that thinking is locking it down. I can't believe I've not done this already. Hi, if we've not met before, I'm Oliver. I'm a marriage and family therapist in Los Angeles, and I work with a lot of people that have anxiety. And if you find any of this useful, I would really appreciate it if you hit like, even better, subscribe. And the best thing of all would be to share it on your social media, your website, and whatever it is you do. Let's put this in even more context by explaining the 5 rules of anxiety. Number 1 is the smoke alarm rule. And this rule says that every text message is a tiger, or that there's a fire when it's just smoke. It says that any fearful thought that pops into our brain should be taken seriously. So if you are walking down a dark alley and you're hearing footsteps behind you, your heart should start racing, your palms might start sweating, your mind might immediately envision a serial killer stalking you. That would be appropriate. But imagine having that exact same physical and mental response while sitting in a work meeting and somebody asks you if there are any questions. Not appropriate. It demands that we believe that all of our fears are important and must be addressed. That leads to a constant state of hypervigilance where any stimulus, internal or external, could be a threat, and we've got to consider it and take it very seriously. It's exhausting. So remember that time where you were absolutely certain you said something embarrassing, and that thought plagued you and bothered you for days and days and days. You replayed it and you felt sick to your stomach and you couldn't handle the idea of running into those people again. And then later you discovered that nobody even heard it. That is part of the prison that this rule puts you in. Rule number 2 is the anxiety boomerang principle. So the more desperately you try and get rid of anxiety, the more it comes back to play. It's that really annoying pit bull puppy. And I have a pit bull, so I'm allowed to say this. The more forcefully you push that pit bull away, the more he thinks you're playing and jumps back with twice the enthusiasm. What you interpret as go away signals, he reads as let's play. But when you calmly acknowledge its presence, yes, I see you, naming it is taming it, it settles down. Anxiety has this rule that makes us believe that we've got to eliminate any feeling of anxiety or discomfort immediately. That leads to avoidance, sometimes compulsions, or any other strategy aimed at suppressing, neutralizing, or getting rid of anxiety. And the problem is, it's like a pendulum. The more you push it one way, the harder it comes back. Rule number 3 is the first day of school illusion. Anxiety creates the illusion that you're standing at the edge of a swimming pool, convinced you'll drown if you jump in. It conveniently helps you forget that you were actually a lifeguard and were on the swim team in high school and know how to swim really well. So this rule makes us believe that we're 5 years old again and it's the first day of school and you don't know anyone and you don't know how to do anything. It leads to a lot of powerless feelings, like people think they lack confidence in their ability to cope with difficult situations, handle negative outcomes or any big feeling. And actually you've survived 100% of your worst days so far, which means you've got a perfect track record of getting through difficult things. Rule number 4 states that every rumble is the big one. Living in California, we're all aware that the big earthquake is going to come at some point, but anxiety tells us that it's actually the big one whenever a door slams too loudly or a truck goes past and the walls vibrate. So anxiety says that if you start feeling anxious, assume the worst. Anxious individuals often misinterpret bodily sensations or ambiguous situations as signs of threat. Sometimes we get nervous when we don't know how to do something complicated like filing taxes. That doesn't mean that we can't do it, but anxiety makes people follow this rule, which means that it is threatening and dangerous and you should not file your taxes or put it off as long as humanly possible. And the broadest rule is rule number 5, which is we're under attack. It's sort of the overarching theme of these rules is that they demand that people with anxiety live in a constant defensive state ready for an attack. Starbucks becomes like a war zone, the gym is like the Hunger Games, and driving to work is like something out of the Squid Games. So therefore, it is important to wear that bulletproof vest while making your pancakes in the morning. Anxiety will utterly convince people to modify their behaviors, their thoughts, their emotions, so they're all geared towards protection, protecting themselves from potential harm or discomfort. So people end up backing away and avoiding, worrying, dreading the future, stop going into unusual or new circumstances where they don't feel comfortable. So if you're recognizing any of these rules in your own thinking, you might want to sign up for my anti-anxiety action plan course, which I'm in the process of creating. So sign up now and you will be the first to know when it goes live. If you sign up today, I'll give you the worksheet and infographics to go along with this video so you can start your anti-anxiety action plan right now. Let's get into the anxiety loop, which is how the 5 rules sort of manifest in thinking patterns for people with anxiety. The 5 rules vary from client to client, but together they create this mindset that is incredibly restrictive. So I like to say that anxiety latches onto things and loves to chew things over to get to the right answer. And sometimes I'll hear this when clients are talking about finding the right diagnosis or the right medication, and they're convinced that that thing will fix everything. And granted, medication might, but it's like there's a fixation on the result versus understanding. I call this the Google spiral. It's a sort of research compulsion. Anxiety drives them to investigate decisions as though their lives depend on the outcome. And I can tell when someone has anxiety when I do a consultation call, because they'll end the conversation and tell me that I'm the 5th therapist that they've spoken to and they've got 4 more calls to make before they let me know their decision. They really need to find that right therapist. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it can lead to the delay dilemma. So it can lead to decision avoidance. This might look like somebody's being very thoughtful and responsible. On the surface, of course, you should talk to other therapists. I actually encourage it. But at some point, you have to decide. Anxiety in some people, though, is actually preventing them from just getting started with any therapist. It's like literally anyone will do. And if you don't like them, then find someone else. But it becomes a delay tactic. Decision avoidance is a really sophisticated defense mechanism. It provides justification for not taking any action, reduces accountability for actually solving the issue, and maintains the problem. Then the doubt dementor will come in. It's a Harry Potter thing, sorry. But when you're paralyzed with indecision, those voices in your head about what you should or shouldn't have done generate even more anxiety. They tell you that you made the wrong decision or make you doubt yourself. You start questioning every choice, which feels awful, like your mind is kind of working against you. And this happens because your brain is desperately searching for certainty in an uncertain world, and sometimes we just have to live with uncertainty. But to make things even worse, anxiety will make you question and doubt any decisions you've made, and that can actually be really disturbing. It messes with our reality. It causes us to doubt our self, our own feelings, and our intuition. It's a process called inferential confusion. It starts as a whisper of doubt. My personal doubt dementor comes in whenever I get to my office, and it says something like, "Are you sure you locked the car? Did you lock the front door? I think you left the oven on." If you listen to that doubt dementor, you start questioning whether you turn the oven off or lock the front door or whatever it is, and then you get anxious, and sometimes even you have to go back home and check. The next part is we'll start the doom file. We'll start collecting evidence to support the worst case scenarios. And the doubt dementor really helps with this. Remember that time 8 years ago when you did leave the oven on? Could have happened again. So we start collecting evidence to support these worst case scenarios. People who worry have an attentional bias to perceived threats, meaning they're already oriented and ready, looking for information to support the worst case scenario, right? And it's storing evidence data, something that you read in the news. It's going to interpret ambiguous events as threatening, negative, or scary when maybe they're just neutral. The doom file collects and stores more and more information about potential dangers, chances of things going wrong, and therefore increases the intensity of this whole anxious experience because now there's proof and validity to it. To get through all of this, we have to find the ultimate answer. We've only got one option, which is the pursuit of certainty. Anxiety really tricks us into thinking that if you research long enough, you will find the right TV on the perfect therapist. And if you keep looking, you will be certain that you've made the right decision because the perfect therapist really does exist. And being certain will make that anxiety go away. Now, there's nothing wrong with that in theory, except there's a fundamental misunderstanding about life's inherent unpredictability and uncertainty. You can research all you want about a therapist, but you won't really know what they're like until you start working with them. If you've got anxiety and you're at this stage of the loop, you're going to believe that if you gather all the information, you can eliminate the possibility of any negative outcome. And that's a misconception that drives this research avoidance cycle. As a therapist, we've kind of got to confront that head on. So let's get into the anti-anxiety plan. And as you can probably tell, we've got to deal with the thinking and the feeling and the actions. So phase one is all about the thinking. A client with anxiety is essentially in a protect and defend mode. Given what we've talked about with the 5 rules of anxiety and the anxiety loop, an anxious person is entirely focused on preventing anything bad from happening, or at least bracing for it if it does. People with anxiety are going to treat every thought like a warning siren that must be silenced at all costs. And that hypervigilance can feel safer in the moment, but it keeps us locked in that cycle and keeps us constantly looking out for more threats. So step 1 is helping clients recognize and understand all of the things that we've talked about so far, the 5 rules, the anxiety loop, and then reshape the mindset that's driving all of that anxious thinking. The goal is to gently confront those self-limiting assumptions and faulty thought systems, basically to show them that not only that they can cope, but they're thinking about things in a slightly illogical way. From that realization, you kind of collaboratively build a new stance, one that's more about accepting and allowing rather than fighting, running away, or avoiding. We're going to call that an accept and allow mindset, right? We're encouraging people to notice and tolerate their anxious thoughts and feelings rather than frantically pushing them away or doing something anxiously. We're going to create some space for discomfort, right? When you start giving space to discomfort, even though it's very unpleasant, we can learn that anxiety and the feelings that come out don't really overwhelm us. And we do actually have the resources to soothe our feelings and tame anxiety. A really simple way that we can get clients to begin to do this is to help clients shift away from seeing every anxious thought as a threat by distinguishing between signal and noise thoughts. So every worried thought that enters our mind initially arrives as a signal. Non-anxious people quickly process that alarm signal and determine that it's just noise. We don't actually have to worry about that right now, or it's not an immediate threat to me right now. Non-anxious people can transform it from signal into noise, but for people with anxiety, everything stays in the signal category. Of course, some thoughts are going to be genuine signals, like realizing that you've got an interview tomorrow and you should prepare, or that you haven't double-checked the batteries in your fire alarm. Those are real problems that call for real solutions. But many of the worries that we think are emergencies are just noise. They actually don't require our immediate attention. And the more we practice noticing which category our thoughts fall into, the more we can respond effectively to the signals and turn things into noise, which we can let go of. We can also help clients reframe worry as a mental game. It helps make a clear distinction between the feeling of that alarm and the intensity of that signal, which is very real and intense, and distinguishing it between the content or process that goes in our head around worry. So when we label things as a game or a trick that our brain plays on us, it becomes easier for us to step outside it, notice it, respond with curiosity rather than panic. Oh, look, there I go worrying about the asteroid that may hit the planet in 3 years' time. That's just the trick my brain plays on me. Stage 2 leans further into accept and allow, and it's more of the feeling stuff. So we've got to focus on letting those deeper emotions come forward rather than fleeing into worry or cognitive chatter. So we already looked at how worry may bring short-term relief, but it also stifles those emotions from coming up. We've got to try and understand that as soon as we get into worry, we're not actually feeling our feelings, and we've got to create space to actually feel fear or sadness or rejection. So it sounds counterintuitive, but that's precisely how we discover that feelings aren't actually going to swallow us whole, and we can tolerate them, and we do have mastery over them. We acknowledge worry as the defense that it is. It's a shield, it's a protective thing. And then we're going to help clients to step back from that defensive stance and accept any feelings that come up. So if we're terrified of rejection, we're going to ask them to lean into that fear. So instead of running from it, we're going to notice if we do feel rejected, yeah, that's going to be painful, but feelings move. Emotion means that they move through us, right? So we're going to allow the body and mind to engage in full emotional processing, and that's when feelings lessen. And I find that once people see that facing deeper feelings doesn't actually overwhelm us, it actually frees us, people become more willing to let discomfort arise. And the final phase, we're focusing on kind of changing behaviors and attitude, which sort of go hand in hand. Activating a new attitude is a challenge, but we're installing new software here to regulate our feelings. The old software says, I can't handle this. The new one is more balanced and more helpful and says, all right, we can do this. I'm feeling afraid right now, but I'm going to feel that feeling and I'm going to see if it helps me learn something. So the way that we speak to our feelings is a real important thing. And it's the thing that your therapist is doing, whether you know it or not. They're saying things like, I think you can cope with it. And you do have the internal resource. Another really important part of this is naming the feeling. Affect regulation starts with naming feelings, right? Well, especially the ones that you're avoiding or not wanting to sit in. Naming it is taming it. So changing the behaviors means encouraging a bit of risk taking and stepping into uncertainty rather than avoiding it. I think I use the word experiment a lot. Let's try an experiment and see what happens if you feel that feeling or do that new thing. An experiment feels less threatening because it's all about curiosity. And again, that is a more expansive mindset rather than a fixed, rigid, closed mindset. We could try an experiment where we practice acting as though setting up a job interview is not a big deal. Maybe you're still going to feel anxious, sure. But let's do it as though that threat of rejection does not warrant your full attention. So taking these little experimental actions starts breaking down the old link between anxiety and avoidance. And when those frightening thoughts inevitably pop up, the final trick might be to start treating them with absurdity, like seeing them not as urgent commands, but as cartoon overblown alarm bells ringing all around you. So as a therapist, you can model this in a session by being playful. Really? That's where you went to? You're modeling an absurd reaction, which you eventually want the client to have. Obviously, you have to have rapport there, and the client has to know your sense of humor, and this has to feel right to you. But I think you can get away with it because you're modeling the reaction that you want the clients to have to their own irrational thoughts. So ultimately, the goal is for the client to adopt those same playful, questioning stances and absurd reactions when they notice their own catastrophic thoughts pop up. It helps clients see how automatically they were thinking worst case scenarios and believing that it was true. So when you play with it, like, oh, hey, look, that's my ridiculous thought monster again, it kind of loosens its grip. Little actions like this of encouraging new behaviors, tolerating them, challenging automatic thoughts are a great way to start shifting attitudes. And when you shift your attitude, you shift your behaviors, and the whole cycle begins to crumble. All right. Again, if you found this helpful, please hit subscribe, like, share. All of the things would be great. It just lets me know that you want to hear more. And if you want to sign up to my mailing list, I will put the link to that below, and I will be sure to let you know as soon as my anti-anxiety action plan is ready to go.